Good evening. All right, thank you all folks for coming this evening. This is a very special, can you hear me now? So I'd like to formally welcome our extended community. We have with us this evening our members of our ESCAR Advisory Board. If I could ask them to please stand. I have Ambassador McDonald, his wife Crystal, Casey Soares, Alan Gropin, and Lester Shaney. Are there any other ones? If you could please stand. Thank you very much for coming. ESCAR has had an extraordinary advisory board over the years, and they continue to be committed to our great causes. We also have a wonderful set of faculty. Would the ESCAR faculty member please stand? We've got several of you. All right. All right. And our ESCAR students, could we ask you to please stand? All right. And I know there are some alumni out there. How about some alumni? Right, there we go. There we go. And to the members of the greater community and those who love ESCAR, how about you all standing too? All right, thank you. Well, most of you know me. My name is Sandra Sheldon. And I am the Vernon and Minnie Lynch Professor at ESCAR, and in that role since 2005, I've had the pleasure of organizing annual Lynch lectures. As you can see, hopefully, from this long list over here, that we have been blessed with a range of experts building theory, improving our practices, engaging prevention and peacemaking activities, and all informing the work that we are so deeply committed to doing. Tonight is a very special occasion in many ways. It's a year of transition of leadership. We have a new dean. It's my pleasure to acknowledge our 11th leader of ESCAR since 30-some years of his existence, Dr. Kevin Averick. He began his deanship on the 10th of this month, and so thank you, Kevin. And would we please ask the First Lady of ESCAR to stand, Sheila, since your life is going to be significantly changed from now on. So two important events are happening right now that we're going to be celebrating. The first is the Lynch Lecture Series. 25 years ago, we began the Lynch Lecture Series. And the second is the inauguration of the PhD program 25 years ago also. So this is a 25-year celebration. And let me begin by thanking the family responsible, first for the Lynch Lecture Series. Edwin and Helen, dear to our hearts, wonderful and extraordinarily generous to us, they endowed a chair on behalf of Ed's parents, Vernon and Minnie, and they gave us a stunning piece of property, their own home at Mason Neck, they call, and we now call, Point of View. They believed in our mission that we must find a way to make this a more peaceful world, and they had a vision to help to continue to broaden our knowledge of conflict theory, research, and practice within our school, with our faculty and students, within the university community, and at the field at large. And one way to do that was to create an annual lecture series. Let me tell you about Ed Lynch. Throughout his long life, he was a Northern Virginian. He was born in Annandale, not too far from here, graduated from Strayer College. He worked for a short time in the U.S. government in the Department of Agriculture and then became very active in real estate. Working with his dad over the last parts of his life before his dad died, and he became the general partner in the Lynch Limited Partnership. Sadly, he left us on March 17th, 2004, when he was 91 years old. Wonderful long life. He was not your typical real estate kind of guy, though. Ed was a member of the Virginia House of Delegates for 7 years. He's self-described left-of-center politician and a Democrat. Decades earlier, active in county politics, he was president of the Fairfax County Young Democratic Club. He's served on many, many boards and active in much of the communities. He was on the Mason Foundation trustee, received the Mason Medal. He was an original member of the ICAR Advisory Board. He was president of Virginia Savings and Loan and board member of Alexandria National Bank. He was board member of the National Association of the Southern and Poor and of the Salvation Army. He was a trustee of Shenandoah College and the Conservatory of Music. He was a patron of the Wolf Trap Foundation Board and awarded many scholarships to aspiring musicians. He called himself an old farmer who loves the good earth. But what I remember him calling, thanks to Chris and Lois Mitchell, when they invited Jean and me to dinner to meet Ed Lynch, he just said, "I'm just the son of a pig farmer." So, Ed was an extraordinarily successful businessman. He owned 3 farms in Fairfax County over his lifetime. The Elmdale Dairy Farm, where he was born and raised in Annandale, became a golf course. The Spring Lake Farm, where he and his family lived for 20 years, was once a horse sporting farm, and now a residential subdivision and shopping center area called Burke, Virginia. So what is this point of view? The last 20 years of his life, he lived at Meadowwood Farm on Mason Neck. This became a gift to Mason in 2000, a particular thrill for me because I happened to be the director at the time, and the gift was specifically said to support the work of ICAR, to create an international retreat and conference center. How cool is that, to support the work of ICAR? How unusual is it for a tiny department in a giant university to get this kind of calling out? Well, Ed believed in peace. He believed in us, he believed in our mission, he believed we must have a more peaceful world for the next generation. So here are some of the things that he did to make that happen. In 1987, he and his wife endowed the ICAR's first chair. They created this annual Lynch Lecture. He was a major key player in establishing the PhD program. In '96, he and Helen created the John Burton Endowment. And if you get to the Fenwick Library, you should check out his Vietnam War protest collection. There you've got materials related to pamphlets, booklets, correspondence, protests, reprints, newspapers, clippings, multitude of meetings on several anti-war groups, and notes from clergy, business, students who all did the protest against the Vietnam War. So thank you, we say to the Lynches this evening, and to Bill and Molly, who have already kept the Lynch legacy active and thriving. So now we'll turn to the 25-year celebration for our PhD program. Mary Ann Lowy Baker sent me a brochure of the first marketing program, and this is part of what came on that brochure. They had already had a master's degree going on for 4 or 5 years, and it said, both degree programs are the first of their kind in the U.S. and both rest securely on the mission of the center to advance the understanding and resolution of significant and persistent human conflicts among individuals, groups, communities, identity groups, and nations. It's pretty much the same mission that we have today. So that was 25 years ago when this group did this. It's going to be my pleasure now to introduce 2 colleagues representing our 25-year celebration and who will move our program along this evening. Most of you know our beloved Christopher Mitchell, Professor Emeritus. He arrived 25 years ago to join the then center's core faculty. That core faculty made up of Dennis Sandoli, who was our first faculty member at the center, along with John Burton, Jim Lowy, Rich Rubenstein, and Chris Mitchell, and Joe Semeka, I'm sorry. With graduate degrees in economics and international relations from London University, Chris had taught around the world, but I bet you didn't know that he taught at Brigham Young University. In the 1960s, Chris worked closely with John Burton at University College in London, where they developed the basic ideas of conflict resolution, of problem-solving workshops, and track 2 interventions into protracted conflicts. Chris is going to be introducing Willie Esterhuyse, our guest speaker this evening. It's also with special pleasure I introduce Yanni Bodas. Yanni's a graduate of ICAR at that time and a member of the first PhD class. He's associate professor at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Baltimore. He got his master's degree at American University and his bachelor's in theater and literature with a minor in history and a one-year honors degree in linguistics at the University of Stellenbosch. Yanni is primarily responsible for securing our speaker this evening, as they are longtime friends and fellow Afrikaners. Chris supervised Yanni's dissertation research 20-some years ago, and together today they are interviewing the mothers and fathers of our field, an oral history and intellectual map of the field of conflict resolution. As I step away until into the program, when I'll come back, Yanni will say a few words about the first PhD class, and then he will introduce Dr. Mitchell, who will formally introduce Dr. Esterhuyse. So thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a bit of a challenged voice. You can hear me? Okay. Thank you again for this opportunity to remember the first doctoral study beginnings of ESCAR. Ladies and gentlemen, I showed Professor Esterhuyse the Johnson Student Center this week, and it is hard to imagine that spot as the two prefab buildings where the then ICAR, the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, was first housed. I don't think most people in this room can still imagine that, what that was like 25 years ago and how humble those beginnings were. Professor Mitchell told me yesterday it was also known as the Hut. Well, it was there in the fall of 1988 when Professor Mitchell came as a faculty member that I joined the first doctoral class. Sadly, no official class pictures were taken in those days. However, the much beloved Professor Jim Lowy, his wife actually, Marianne, always invited doctoral classes to their house once a semester, and many pictures were taken there. Actually, many of the early pictures of classes only exist because of those get-togethers and those pictures. The picture I'm about to show you was provided to me also by Marianne Lowy, and it is, I believe, the only existing picture of ICAR's first doctoral class. And here we are with the late Jim Lowy. 3 of these 9 first students departed with master's degrees. So let me focus on the now ESCAR's first 6 doctoral students. At the top, from the left, second from the left, Barry Hart, now a faculty member at Eastern Mennonite University's Conflict Transformation Program, 2 hours drive from here in Southern Virginia. Next to him, someone I hope you will now recognize, as our new dean so aptly pointed out this week, he had more hair 25 years ago. So, ladies and gentlemen, next to me, Dick Kokoza, who worked and consulted on the Hill in Washington, D.C. And next to Dick, Diane Laresh, who also consults and has done very interesting work in indigenous peacemaking in the United States. At the end of the top row, the tall gentleman, Frank Dukes from UVA, University of Virginia, where he's the director of the Institute for Environmental Negotiation. And in the front row here, on the left, in the blue, Nimet Biriker, the only other foreign student in that first semester, who returned to Turkey, where she's from, and is now at the Sabancı University. You might note that the first generation of doctoral students was much older than they are now, plus minus 15 or so years older. Most of us had other careers before we became doctoral students. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't think you can imagine this, but we actually took a huge risk in joining a new and in many ways experimental doctoral degree. Professor Mitchell actually acknowledged to me 3 days ago, and I was so glad I didn't know that for the first 2-3 years, it wasn't sure that the program was going to continue. Ladies and gentlemen, if you all in this room promise me, and I want to promise, not to tell the first generation of faculty, the late Lowy, Chris Mitchell, who is here, Rich Rubenstein, who is here, Sandoli, Professor Sandoli, who is here, I believe Sameka is not here, that I said so, I will tell you this. I will tell you that I think we stayed because we really loved and respected them for their knowledge and how they treated us. Mrs. Lowy continued to host subsequent doctoral classes at their home and took more pictures. And here is another one. I'm sure many people in this room will recognize many of those faces. I don't have time to go through them tonight. We promised to create a website on ESCAR's website and she gave me about another 30 pictures to put all those pictures up there. So at the end of my first doctoral year, somewhere towards the end or middle rather of 1989, I went back to South Africa and specifically wanted to visit my alma mater. I thought you'd like to see this, the University of Stellenbosch. You thought UVA was pretty? Go to Stellenbosch. My mission was to call on another much beloved professor under whom I never studied, but whom I knew personally and professionally, the philosopher Willie Esterhuyse. I would actually like you to see a second picture of the University of Stellenbosch, surrounded by 3 mountains. Mrs. Annemarie Esterhuyse, sitting here in the front looking at me, a then math professor, also here with us tonight, told me that her husband was flying in from London when I tried to make contact and see him. He was landing very early that morning in Cape Town, about 2 hours from Stellenbosch, hour from Stellenbosch, depending how you drive. And she graciously invited me to lunch. Prof. Willie, as he was known, he was generally known as Prof. Willie, took me for a walk after lunch. He said he wanted to tell me something, but I had to promise not to ask him why he was making the statement he was about to make. He repeated, "Jannie, you cannot ask me why I say this." And then he made this very simple statement. Apartheid is over, you can come back if you want to. How did he know? As I later found out, that morning he returned from the secret talks to end apartheid in London. In less than a year, Mandela was free. Last summer, when I visited him in South Africa, he noted, "How ironic, Jannie. Here we are, 25 years later, with a shared interest in second-track diplomacy in problem-solving workshops." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my segue to a man who has probably forgotten more about problem-solving and second-track diplomacy than I will ever learn. A parent of the field in his own right, our very own Professor Christopher Mitchell. Chris?
All right, somewhat to my surprise, I find that I have to make 4 introductions to you this evening. I have to introduce an idea, I have to introduce part of a film, I have to introduce a book, and then I have to introduce our speaker. We'll get round to you soon, Willie. The idea, the theme, actually arises from our speaker's choice of title for this evening's presentation, and that's the theme of talking to the enemy. I've come across this phrase anyway in an old Arab proverb, which goes something like this, that you do not make peace by talking to your friends, you make it by talking to your enemies, which on the surface of it sounds perfectly obvious and perfectly sensible, but it has no real echo of the difficulties of actually doing this. Talking to your enemy is very hard, and it can be extremely dangerous. It can be very hard to start up, and as the excerpt from the film that we're going to show you will emphasize, it is equally hard to keep going, not to walk away. The film, which Professor Esterhuyse has sort of indicated to me has dogged his footsteps like an unpleasant hound over the last few years, was actually made in 2009. And it is an account of a series of conversations that took place between a number of really very brave South Africans at a time when conversations and discussions between, on the one hand, the members of the Afrikaner community and the Nationalist Party in South Africa, then in power, were very unwilling to be seen talking in any way, shape or form to their opponents, particularly their opponents from the African National Congress, the ANC. To undertake talks like this was a very risky business. It could actually lay you open to accusations at the best of naivety, at hopeless optimism, or at worst, to treachery. So that the people who took part in these conversations, which lasted from 1987, which was at almost the height of the South African government's policy of separate development, as it was called, apartheid, and 1991, when the ANC was unbanned and its leader, Nelson Mandela, was finally released from prison after 27 years in jail. And it seems to me quite clear from reading the history of that time that the set of conversations played a major, major role in bringing the apartheid system to an end. The film tracks this through from efforts to set up these conversations, which were allegedly and actually in reality secret, off the record, out of the public eye, but at which people managed to talk to each other as human beings rather than as representatives of particular political movements. It is a film which I would commend to you, but we're going to show you a couple of extracts from it to give you some idea about the process by which the conversations took place, what they discussed, some of the obstacles, and it ends on a sort of a triumphant note in 1990 with the release of the leaders of the ANC, with the unbanning of the opposition parties and the beginnings of serious negotiations to turn South Africa away from a, forgive the word, racist regime to something more like a multi-ethnic, multiple philosophy country that it is now. We start these extracts from the film about a third of the way through. The first third of it more or less deals with the problems that the sponsors of this initiative had in trying to set up the actual meetings and gather people who are willing to sit down and talk to one another. The South African nationalist group, of course, was led by Professor Willie Esterhuyse, and on the other side of the table was one of the leaders of the ANC, Thabo Mbeki. So could we have the film now?
Walter knows about these talks.
Oh
I'm instructed to report back to him via Dr. Barnard in National Intelligence. I'm to be their Trojan horse.
You take a risk telling me this, Professor.
It would be a risk not telling you. Without trust, we'll achieve nothing.
Tambo says if we are to win our freedom, we must first banish bitterness. This will be the test of it.
For all of us.
In South Africa today after a bomb exploded outside a shopping centre in Rudaport near Johannesburg. 4 civilians were killed and 18 others injured. A spokesman claimed the target was a nearby bank. He declined to give details on the operational difficulties which caused the explosion.
Is that how you justify your campaign of indiscriminate bombings, killing of innocent civilians?
We have never supported the killing of civilians.
Tell that to the women and children that you maim and kill with your limpet bombs and your pipe bombs that are dead children. Legitimate collateral damage to promote your cycle of terror.
I can quote you chapter and verse on dead children, Professor. Names, ages, and dates, my son included.
Yes, I think a break is in order, gentlemen.
ANC policy is and always has been that only military and economic targets are legitimate.
If it smells like crap and it sounds like crap, chances are it is crap. Not once have I tried to justify the excesses of the South African security forces. Yet you persist in spouting this pre-digested dogma at me.
Maybe they think if they say it enough times, we'll buy it.
This really is not productive, so either we move
The
on.
timing of the Rudaport bomb isn't coincidental. Lusaka authorized it in the full knowledge of our meetings. Still terror tactic. Once the talking starts, step up the violence. If you think that's going to strengthen your hand in any negotiations with the government, you've seen to it that all chance of that is off the table. Frankly, possibly for now. So it talks.
This is the situation. All ANC bombing operations fall under the command and control structure in Lusaka. But some of our cadres, believing force to be the only way, sometimes act without authority. Operations can get bungled. Innocent people get killed. But you have my word that I will do everything in my power to ensure that civilians no longer suffer from our inadequacies.
Are you telling us that you are unable to control some of your renegade cadres, Mr. Mbeki?
If you know the truth of our situation, Professor, you will see that the issue of violence is irrevocably connected to the other issues we wrestle with. Only when we can participate in a truly democratic process will our armed struggle become obsolete. Only then will the conflict between us end.
I apologize. I lost track of Maureen.
Should we start by returning to the outstanding items from yesterday?
I wonder, do you mind? I'm sorry. On behalf of my brother, I have some issues for clarification. If you bear with me. One, when would it be possible for the ANC to embark on talks about how to progress formal negotiations with the government? Two, what would your preconditions be to such talks? And three, what agenda would be acceptable to you?
You can tell the president there will be no preconditions on our side. And we leave it to him to determine the agenda. As for timing, we're ready when he is.
And your position on a ceasefire of violence?
We would order that all violence be suspended while negotiations take place. When a new constitution has been agreed, we will give the instruction that the armed struggle is to be abandoned.
We owe you so much more. It takes a big man to make himself invisible.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stay safe. And you, comrade.
I think some of you may have recognized William Hurt, struggling to get the Afrikaner accent right and almost succeeding. The book, of course, is Professor Esterhuyse's own 2012 version of the events that you've just seen in a rather Hollywood production. It's the film is something that he described to me as faction. That it's not totally inaccurate, but it doesn't go far enough. So I hope you won't mind a commercial plug which says, "See the film, buy the book." All right, my last introduction is, of course, the most important because if that was faction, then we have the very good fortune of having somebody who's not read about these events or seen them on what in my young day was called the silver screen, but has actually lived them. I'm sure in his talk he will expand upon some of the aspects of this very, very difficult talk with the enemy that he was part of. We shouldn't forget, however, that of course Professor Willie Esterhuyse has a very distinguished career as an academic and not simply as a peacemaker. He's been professor of philosophy at the University of Stellenbosch until the late 1990s, while all this was going on. He probably came to prominence in the 1970s by actually producing quite a stunning book for somebody who was, I think, labeled at that time as a National Party progressive. And he wrote a book in 1979 called Apartheid Must End. And if you think about that in a time when it looked as if it was going to go on forever and ever, it was quite an extraordinary piece of work to produce. I've gone on far too long. I think now it's my great pleasure to introduce my last introduction of the evening. You'll be glad to hear Professor Willie Esterhuyse to talk to us about talking with the enemy.
Thank you very much for the welcome. My mother tongue, or the tongue of my mother, is Afrikaans. It's a language spoken by at least 25% of the total population of 50 million, white and black. I hope that you will find my talk interesting and that you will also find my version of English interesting. I have to start my talk with a quote. Our first simple and happy task is to say thank you. Thank you very much to you all. Thank you that you chose to care, because you could have decided otherwise. Thank you that you elected not to forget, because our fate could have been a passing course. Mr. Mandela, in London, after his release, I was in London when he made that speech. And I remember the sentences as if it was forever embedded in my consciousness. Thank you that you chose to care. Thank you that you elected not to forget. Our fate could have been a passing course. And at this 25th annual lecture, I would like to endorse Mr. Mandela's words of recognition and gratitude. Talking to the enemy would not have taken place in my country without the pressures applied by the international community. Well, thank you that you chose to care, that you elected not to forget, and that you prevented the cause of freedom and democracy in my country from becoming a passing course. And thank you for inviting me to do this lecture. I'm always impressed by those who are prepared to spend their money on good causes. And what I saw here was something which I hope I'll see more and more in my own country. And thank you to George Mason University, the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and all those involved in making it possible for me to participate in this event. In the year you organized your first Lynch lecture, I had my first meeting, 1987, with leaders from the ANC in exile. And in fact, in the year you organized the second meeting, 1988, I had 3 meetings with Thabo Mbeki and a few others, including our incumbent president, Mr. Jacob Zuma. I'm always intrigued by historical coincidences. There is some irony in history. There is one I don't like to talk about. My birthday was on the 19th of August, 1936, and it was the exact date when Joseph Stalin started with his mock trials against his enemies and his old friends. But please forget about what I've said. One of Africa's many cultural contributions is storytelling. The South African story is a story of many voices. My voice is but one of so many other voices. Michel Foucault, the French philosopher whose thought had an influence on my intellectual development, said during his inaugural address more or less the following: I wished I could have slipped in unobserved in this discourse, part of an anonymous discourse, a voice which has preceded me, but nevertheless captured me, swept along. My voice, personalized as the speaker tonight, contains many voices, many stories, many discourses. I was, for instance, captured and swept along by numerous American voices. I have to honor some of them. Harold Volpe, a member of the House of Representatives, when he was my improbable and impossible friend, Harold. Then Wayne Fredericks, an Under Secretary of State at one time, and later involved with the Ford Foundation. He was a very persuasive person, but he was a gentle American. John Dellenbach from the House of Representatives, who also served as director of the Peace Corps. And then Helen Kitchen, the flag bearer of the United States South African Leadership Exchange Program. And then I met one person tonight we've never met, and that is Ambassador John MacDonald, and he's sitting here in front with his wife. And I owe everything to him because of the books I read about second-track diplomacy. He published with someone else, I will refer to it in my talk, in 1987. I read that book in 1988. There was a reason. I had no idea how to do and deal with these talks. So I had to start reading, and I read his book. And I'm so thankful that you're here, and what you really want to say, thank you, because your voice, through your books, played a role in my story, in my country. Thank you very much. There was another voice, and that was the US State Department. Can you believe it? In 1978, and I think Mr. Carter was the president. I still have to find out whether they borrowed the money to make my trip possible in your country. And in San Francisco, I experienced one of my many defining moments during a tough discussion until after midnight with a few black professionals. I walked away, I think it was about 2 o'clock that morning, with a book which one of them gave me, and he was one of the writers. And the title of the book, and I have the book in my hand, the title of the book was Black Rage. The writers William Greer and M. Cobbs, two black psychologists. And the book captured me, swept me away. I have the book here in my hand, and it is a book that I always will treasure very much. Because what happened, there was something in this book. It was written by Fred Harris, and he was a United States senator. And there's one single sentence was in that book which captured me. And the sentence was, "It is still no easy thing to be a black person in America." And I had to ask the question and tell myself, it is not an easy thing to be a black person in my country, South Africa. I want to proceed as follows. In broad outline, tell you the story of my involvement with what were called Talks About Talks with the ANC, starting in September 1987 and ending in June 1990. And then secondly, say something about the model which emerged during the talks, how it developed over time, and what we have learned. And then thirdly, address the question, where do we stand today regarding peace and reconciliation in South Africa? 3 points. I studied theology, and at the place where I studied theology in Stellenbosch, my professor taught me and said, listen, you must have 3 points in a sermon. I think it has to do with the number 3 or the trilogy. But in any case, I have my 3 points here in front of me. Now the story. South Africa's history, particularly during the 80s, was written in blood. The country was entrapped in deadly conflict with the South African government facing a people's war. Now this particular war, the People's War, was inspired by talks in 1978 between ANC leaders, including Thabo Mbeki, and the Vietnamese, particularly General Giap, who was then still, I think he died a couple of months ago. People's War made many areas in South African townships ungovernable. Children with sticks and stones confronting men in uniforms with guns. It was during those dark days that I was confronted by a question which haunted me for many years and in fact still haunts me. Are non-violent resistant movements really more successful than movements opting for violence to bring about negotiated settlements and meaningful change? A number of factors during the 1980s necessitated the need for a negotiated process, settlement process in South Africa. The first one, the global scene changed. With the Soviet Union, a primary sponsor of the ANC, breaking up. There is a story, I think it's true, but I call it a story. My friend Mbeki and that states the president of the ANC, Oliver Tambo, and Joe Slovo from Umkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing, visited Moscow, met with President Gorbachev. And Slovo was interested in money and guns. And then President Gorbachev told the delegation, you have to start talking with these Afrikaners there in Pretoria. And then he gave Mr. Slovo a signed photograph of himself with no guns and no money. The global scene changed. Secondly, Southwest Africa or Namibia, with the assistance of the major international powers, including the USA, firmly on the the road of independence. The end of apartheid should also be linked to what happened in Angola and in Namibia. And thirdly, the ungovernability of many areas in South Africa due to the effects of People's War. A hurting stalemate emerged between apartheid's firepower or hardware and people's power or software. Many whites, Afrikaners included, began to realize that the oppressed and their children are prepared to die for the cause of freedom. And it caused a re-evaluation of their prospects for the future and also a sharpening of moral sensitivities and, very important, a questioning, serious questioning of addictions to old loyalties. And then fourthly, the South African economy and the vested interests of the white elite came under pressure. Financial sanctions cracked the comfort zone of white business. Sanctions were successful in getting the white elite to accept the idea of a negotiated settlement and to start talking to the enemy. I hesitate to put these and other factors into one basket, but I feel it can be labeled as follows. The time was right, ripe for sincere talks, to quote Bill Zartman and his book from 1985, which I also read in an attempt to understand these sort of processes. It has to be said that many major mindset changes took place during the mid-80s among key government officials who argued against a lot of criticism that South Africa was in need of a political solution for its predicament and not a military one. It was during these times that the National Intelligence Service moved to the front of the political debate within the National Party and within government. And the National Intelligence Agency, NIS, was in competition with military intelligence. As an institution, it eventually became more involved in the preparatory process. And I was and still is intrigued by the fact that intelligence services are able to play that kind of role. The Minister of Justice, who was the political head of intelligence, he started talking confidentially to Nelson Mandela in 1985. It was the beginning of a series of talks, it became known as the prison talks. And through him and the intelligence service, a number of these talks took place, more than 40 of those confidential talks. The president, P.W. Botha, was the only person who was informed. Not a single other person of the cabinet or politician was informed. The present talks were crucial, very crucial, pre-negotiation talks, extremely risky, and a good reason for confidentiality. And I've learned one thing during this period, that risk-taking is part and parcel of these kind of talks. These talks, whatever the initial motives could have been, were not just exploring Mandela's views on a negotiated settlement, as it is being published nowadays, or said nowadays. They were also aimed at preparing South Africa's president, P.W. Botha, for a meeting with Nelson Mandela. At that stage, a most unlikely and even a revolutionary idea. The dilemma in this regard was neatly described in 2004 by the intelligence boss, who said, to put, and I quote, to put the matter of discussions with Mandela into perspective, let me suggest a comparison. The state of national security at that time in South Africa made it as likely for Botha to talk to Mandela as it would be now for President George Bush to invite Osama bin Laden to the White House. And I think it was a neat and nice description. On July 1989, 4 years after the secret talks with the present talks started, with strict security measures in place and classified as top secret, Prisoner Mandela met with President P.W. Botha. The prisoner became a president within 5 years after that. The meeting was dubbed the Teenage Tea Party. It was short, but it went extremely well. But it was different from your tea party. My involvement in a segment of the complex and delicate pre-negotiation process started with 2 telephone calls during the first half of 1987. The first call came from London on behalf of a British company, Consolidated Goldfields. The second call came from Pretoria. I never asked them why they made that phone call, but it was a few weeks apart. And as it turned out, it was the person on that side of the line and who I met later was from National Intelligence. And they asked me whether I would be prepared to facilitate or participate in a group that discusses the future of South Africa. Very vague and so on, but I had a good idea what they were actually trying to tell me. After careful consideration, I agreed, having my talks with the leaders from the ANC in exile in mind. At that stage, I was not in the know about the informal and confidential contacts with Nelson Mandela. Between 1987 and 1990, a total of 8 3-day meetings took place in Britain. A couple of one-on-one meetings between Mbeki and myself also took place. We called it talks within talks. 2 of the bigger meetings, at the request of the ANC participants, included very prominent Afrikaner businessmen. One of the meetings in Britain took place during the weekend of Mandela's release, on the weekend of the 9th to 11th of February, and it was really an emotional experience. Our meetings covered a very specific set of agenda points. 1, violence as a means to achieve political ends and how this issue should be dealt with. Secondly, how to create a climate for negotiations and what the conditions should be to start the process. We spent a lot of time on what we called the preconditions. Who should participate in the process was the third agenda point. Last one, the role of the economy and business in a future dispensation. And related to this issue, the issue of sanctions. The consensus was, and I think it was an important consensus, a wasteland will destroy the potential for a successful transition. The present talks were one of South Africa's best kept secrets. But neither the full cabinet, as I've said, not even the clerk in the know. The talks that we had in Britain, there was one leak in 1989. One of the problems we faced was to practice damage control. There are always spoilers around, and you need to find out and identify who the spoilers are. During May 1989, and this is an important date, I was requested to travel to London and meet with Thabo Mbeki to tell him that National Intelligence wants to talk directly to him and that he must provide a reliable telephone number. I also had to convey to him the code word his scholar will use. The code was John Campbell. Mbeki's code was John Semelani. I deliberately planned the meeting with Thabo Mbeki for the 31st of May, apartheid South Africa's Day of the Republic. We became a republic after South Africa walked out of the Commonwealth. So it was symbolic for me to meet with him on that particular day. The first meeting between Mbeki and Jacob Zuma and two senior officials of the National Intelligence took some time to materialize. There were telephonic contact between them, between Pretoria and Lusaka. That meeting took place only on the 12th of September 1989 in Lucerne, Switzerland, a few days after the clerk's election as president. The clerk, still not in the know about the initiatives, was informed about a few days before his inauguration as president. He was caught by surprise, initially even angry. However, that day, he made the most important decision in his life, because he said, after he listened to these agents, he decided, I'll run with the ball. And he started running with the ball. Which brings me to my second point, what have we learned? There was agreement that the exploratory phase in environments of deadly conflict should be regarded as a high-risk gamble, not a place for a moralistic sentimentalist. Chances of failure are much higher than chances of success. This reality, more than anything else, necessitated three commitments by the participants. First one, confidentiality. Second one, the right to deniability by those in the know, but not directly involved. And then the third one, responsibility by those directly involved to accept whatever comes their way. Now, I was very much not influenced by the works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And that particular work was my work in the discussions, that we should take responsibility, whatever the outcome. That is exactly what we did. One of the first informal protocols we agreed upon during our talks about talks was the issue of who should participate in the preparatory and confidential phase of the settlement. National intelligence was strongly opposed to what has been referred to as civil diplomacy, efforts on the part of institutions, organizations, and individuals from civil society to bring the state and the ANC in contact with each other. Both the South African government and the ANC wanted to control all facets of the settlement process without international involvement, as happened in Namibia. It was in those days that I began to understand Mbeki's position: Africans must resolve Africa's problems. One of the first informal agreements reached in Switzerland between government officials and the ANC was about the exclusion of persons and bodies that were outside the informal and formal negotiation process. Two issues cropped up. The one was the issue of trust and confidence building. The second one, the issue of the transfer of communication and communication of messages, information, and insight to relevant decision makers. In my attempt to come to an understanding of these two issues, I was significantly influenced by what I read about the negotiations on nuclear disarmament in Vienna. And the book I've already mentioned, Conflict Resolution, Track 2, Diplomacy, published in 1987, with the editors John MacDonald and D.B. Bendemein. The Vienna story, which I'm not going to relate, is a fascinating story, And because I don't want my time to sort of catch up with me, it's a fascinating story, and I even went to see the play, Walk in the Woods, that was written by Lee Blessing on the Vienna story and the negotiations that took place there. In fact, the guy who was very much involved in the Vienna story is Father Theodore Hesberg from Notre Dame. I went to see him at Notre Dame and had a wonderful discussion with him in his office at Notre Dame. And it is so that one can learn from plays, films, and also the literature. In our relationship building and rehumanizing of each other during these talks about talks, we had to deal with a very difficult issue, which is called the construct of the enemy, and which was something very real in South Africa. We were in a civil war. I deliberately also use the word when I talk about these things about the protracted side of violence and conflict in South Africa, because it had a very long history. It had a structural history and also more visible history. In my experience, the construct of the enemy fulfilled the following functions. Function of divide and rule. Second one, demonizing the other. Legitimizing violent response. Mobilizing support. And then the last one, militarizing the country. We realized very soon that context analysis was not enough, and that honest conflict analysis was needed. An expanded and shared understanding of the conflict, or at least a serious attempt at understanding the views on the reasons and nature of the conflict from the perspectives of the talking enemies. The talks about talks were a deliberate attempt to dismantle the construct of the enemy and to create the construct around the idea of mediating and eventually negotiating partners. Mandela was well aware of the barriers created by the construct of the enemy. I quote him, "To make peace with an enemy, one must work with that enemy, and that enemy becomes your partner." The peace process is all about getting and working together of unlikely and improbable people. I would like to also quote Mbeki, an interview, where he said it was no easy task. Within the ANC, this is Mbeki, the cry was to catch the bastards and hang them. But we realized that you could not simultaneously prepare for a peaceful transition while saying we want to catch and hang people. So we paid a price for the peaceful transition. If we had not taken this route, I don't know where the country would have been today. Had there been a threat of Nuremberg-style trials over members of the apartheid security establishment, we would never have undergone the peaceful change. And I agree with him. I do not want to take up too much time, but we organized the talks about talks more or less as follows. 1, a formal, mutually agreed agenda facilitated by an independent, non-South African and executed as a problem-solving workshop, not just a talk shop. And then secondly, enough time for socializing. Walking in the woods, drinking South African wines, and eating South African fruit on the sanctions list. Yeah, I won't say this because I'm a professor also in business ethics, but I smuggled some of the fruit and wines into Britain. The rule was, and I think this was important during that informal session, which included a very formal dinner in typical English style, on the evening of her arrival, the rule was no politics or controversial subjects should be discussed or even raised at this occasion. The critical issue with regards to unofficial, unmandated and confidential second-track talks between enemies is the issue of the transfer of messages, information and insights to key decision makers. In the case of the present talks, transfer was not an issue. A few senior officials, the Minister of Justice and President P.W. Botha. The talks about talks in Britain were a little bit more complex because I was the go-between in the end between Mbeki and many of the others and national intelligence agents, and they had both the intelligence agency and Mbeki had to believe that what I was saying was the right thing I was saying, and that I was not saying what they don't think I was saying. It was a very complex issue, and maybe I should just in a lighter vein, it was a fantastic experience to be debriefed by intelligence officials. I've never heard the word, but then it was quite an experience. How to preserve, I think this is the important thing, how to preserve a high measure of trust and confidence in such a situation remained a constant challenge to the participants, because selling out, or even worse, falling into a trap, it follows all pre-negotiation initiatives like a dark shadow. One of the things I did was I made a commitment to Mbeki. In fact, I wrote it up, and I said, listen, you know, this is the trap by national intelligence. I've got a document in London in a safe, and there's a journalist with access to that document. If something happens to you or to me, then she will be in a position to just publish it. The idea of talking in good faith is a motivating idea, but how to make it work is something else. And that's the reason, and we've seen it in film. My first meeting with Mbeki, I told him of my connections with Pretoria, which national intelligence said to me, they will decide on that. I said, no, it's my decision. So that's why I decided to do that, and I think it was a very important decision. Let me just summarize this. There are two other characteristics of the talks, the reason for the success of the talks, about talks. The first one was very interesting. We started to make progress on the issue of the way forward. We had an agenda item, the way forward. But we started to make progress the moment there was agreement among us that complete victory for one side was out of the question. And it took us some time. And then secondly, we did not avoid putting hard truths on the table, enabling the participants to understand each other's positions. The issue about the violence was one of the problematic ones. And then thirdly, we spent much time on the socio-economic conditions in our country. The Afrikaner businessman acknowledging at the very early stage of the dialogue that the destructive realities of race-based discrimination, high unemployment rates, and the need for redress have to be part of the envisaged peace process. So where do we stand today? Does South Africa experience sustainable peace and development after nearly 2 decades of democracy? We are still involved in a process of peacemaking and peace building amidst conflicts and violence of all sorts. Histories of protracted conflict and violence do not end with a relatively peaceful democratic election. In particular, if the root causes of the conflict and violence were not addressed, but exchanged for quick fixes of the symptoms. This is the reason why resolute and honest conflict analysis is of paramount importance. The mistake we made was, I think, to think of violence in a very restricted political and not multi-dimensional manner. The system of apartheid brutalized those on the receiving end. And brutal cultures create legacies. Whether those who benefited from the system of apartheid, like it or not, the fact of the matter is that this apartheid system, a form of structural and practical violence, created a legacy. And how to deal with this legacy and understand its role and place in a comprehensive conflict analysis is the tricky issue if you are committed to peace building. The metaphor root causes, which I used earlier on, is a very important metaphor. It suggests potential growth under certain positive conditions if the roots remain a reality. And these roots can lie dormant for many years in the consciousness and memory bank of people and new generations until they get triggered to grow, inspiring revenge and retributive justice. Peace processes and reconciliation on the basis of forgive and forget do not cater for sustainability. It represents a form of denialism. To align myself with Hannah Arendt, it is all about forgive and remember, but a memory energized by an experience of justice, a just peace. What does this entail? Transitions from authoritarian rule and structurally skewed social order are protracted and complex processes. Managed transformations over time which radically change the relations of power and influence of the old order of things and new elites emerging. I use the following to assess our transition. I use the following 4 criteria. First of all, a broadening and deepening of democracy based on a functional constitution and vibrant civil society. I'll give it 8 out of 10. I think we've made it. Secondly, wealth and job creation, rising incomes. Let me give you a figure. A significant change is taking place on the level of the middle class. In a recent study, it was found that the black middle class has reached a total of 4.2 million and is still growing. The buying power, $42 billion. The white middle class stands at 2.8 million with signs of stagnation. The buying power, $38 billion. The wealth still on the side of the white middle class. However, I must say on the downside, 2 other criteria: equitable distribution of wealth, visible alleviation of poverty, and then social cohesion, or a stable social fabric, and the existence of a commonly shared national identity and destiny. We do not score well. We do not score well. It is extremely problematic at the moment. We are not a nation celebrating a national identity despite our diversity. We're not, as a nation, inspired by a common vision and a founding idea on where we want to be tomorrow. Despite trying very hard to become comfortable with diversity, we still have a long way to go. For instance, illustrated on Sundays in the majority of churches, one of the most segregated spaces of the week. Admittedly, social cohesion and the cultivation of forms of bonding and bridging and linking social capital in environments which have experienced protracted forms of structural and physical violence is a complex process. Apartheid created racially prescribed social distances, having a direct impact on an issue I've mentioned earlier on, trust and confidence building. what I'm trying to say is that the problems generated by the construct of the enemy were exacerbated by legally constructed separate identities in South Africa, and how to liberate ourselves from this legacy in order to become comfortable with diversity proved to be a daunting task. I want to refer to something that I got from John Paul Lederach when I spent some time at Notre Dame University. He referred to the justice gap. We have a justice gap in South Africa, and I have to share with you something very personal. I'm currently involved with the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute, located in Pretoria. My course deals with the issue of peace building in deeply divided societies plagued by deadly conflict. Participants come from South Africa and from across the continent. I experience them as the new emerging professional, moral, and intellectual leadership of the future. Whatever I say, which textbook and authority I quote, or name of an African leader who has dealt with the issue of peace I mention, all their questions always return back to one single issue: the connection between peace and justice, the justice gap. As a Kenyan participant stated last year, I quote him, "The absence of open conflict and violence is a bonus, but not an indicator of sustainable peace. Justice is the name of the game." His remark opened an intense debate on the issue of structurally produced forms of inequalities and violence, and the need for safety and quality of life. We have a serious problem in South Africa, the justice gap. Lederach makes a point. The justice gap happens when open violence diminishes through national courts, but people's expectations for some level of incremental improvement of their basic needs are not met in a practical manner. A deep sense of betrayal and of a cheap political peace often is experienced. I agree with ex-President Joachim Chissano of Mozambique on what is needed. Capable states, I quote him, good governance, a serious fight against corruption, and a sustained process of national dialogue. Sustained process. Brigadier Bam, who did a great job to take us through 3 successful elections as chair of the Electoral Commission, recently said, "We may have been doing many remarkable things, but we seem to have unlearned the power of real dialogue, which has served us so well in the past. We confuse dialogue with robust debate, conferences and consultations, which leave most people deflated and disillusioned." And I go on with the quote. "Our negative experiences of being in contested spaces where the battle for the supremacy of ideas destroy our ability to unite around a common vision are reinforcing a growing fatigue and a belief that it does not help to talk. The inability, or maybe even unwillingness, to get the real dialogue going, creating spaces for dealing, for instance, with the justice gap, is an Achilles heel of my country. We do have something on the table, the National Development Plan, a medium to long-term vision of the future, which should be the primary focus of a national, regional, and localized dialogue across party political, ideological, and ethnic barriers, an inclusive discourse, sweeping us along, capturing the nation, a truly non-racial dialogue. I want to conclude with Brigalia Bom, who is currently involved in Women in Dialogue organization. Our young democracy is now entering into a phase where we can no longer ignore the value of dialogue. No longer can we rely on our struggle credentials and our past heroes. We need to become the heroes of today and tomorrow. Our legacy should not be sought in monuments for fallen heroes, but the united nation that unlocks the potential of all its peoples, especially the youth. I endorse this statement. We South Africans accept the future belongs to us. Africans, black, white-colored nation. Our fate is, however, not only in our hands. Your choice to care and not to forget, to quote Mandela, is part of our future, dealing effectively with the justice gap. Thank you.
So if you would stay here. We have some time for a few questions, and we have two students who are going to be covering the two sides of the room, and they will do a question from the front and the back. So we'll sort of zig-zag our way around. So if you could please stand so that we'll see that you want to ask a question. We'll bring you a microphone.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I wanted to pick up on the Peace and Justice Letter Act point, and your point about Nuremberg. You had made a brief statement that had something like Nuremberg occurred, it may have been very difficult for the peace to move forward, and that in one sense it seems that South Africa chose peace over a kind of justice or a certain notion of justice. And I've been thinking a lot about this accountability that we're often discussing in many circles. And when you're focused on this kind of accountability, in some ways are we preventing peace? And if this just applies to South Africa, or would you say that it also could apply to other circumstances? Does my question make sense? Mm-hmm. That I'm asking that it seems to me in South Africa that there was a choice of peace over justice. There was a lot of collective accountability that was pushed aside in order to move ahead.
Yeah.
I'll try to make it short and sweet, because there's only water here and nothing in the water. The problem with peace, let me say it, because of Mandela, and I think it is an incredible legacy, reconciliation became the name of the game. It was necessary. Without that, we wouldn't have been where we are now. I go a little bit further and say it's very important, but we need to talk about peace. Now, you can talk about peace in two ways. The one is negative peace. When you say, listen, I don't like you. And I'm not going to like you, but I will not kill you. It's negative. And I think to a certain extent we're there. And then positive peace about something else. This is what Mandela had in mind when he spoke about the clerk. He said, listen, we need to work together for a common vision. Not in the sense that this vision is a party political one, but it's a vision, in my opinion, where we have to look at socio-economic stuff, particularly the justice gap, which in my very simplified manner say, the poor. Because the poor in South Africa are getting younger and blacker. And there's at the lower end of the pyramid. There's no way that this pyramid can be held together by stories about reconciliation. And peace, in the end, is about what's going to happen down at the bottom of the pyramid, whether we create jobs, whether we educate people, whether we give them an opportunity to live their lives in a manner that is dignified.
Understood. Thank you.
In the back?
Well, my name is Florindo, and I'm from Angola. I'm your neighbor. And I was wondering, what is your take on violence against immigrants in South Africa? And
The violence?
yes, against immigrants in South
Yeah.
Africa.
The nature of the violence in South Africa, of course, has changed. It's not so much political violence. It's criminal violence, and it's also, it's not what I say. Let me remark, I have a document here, which I got from the Minister of Arts and Culture. I'm supposed to be an advocate, or I was nominated as an advocate for social cohesion. My age, I like these sort of titles. So he sent me a document, a fantastic document about social cohesion. And what I was saying here was what he said in his document. So what I'm trying to say is also that government people on the ministerial level are admitting we've got a couple of problems, serious problems. And one of the things that he emphasized, he said, listen, and we made a declaration at Kliptown in Soweto last year on social cohesion and unity. And it's included in the document. And one of the things that he pointed out, and also that conference, was the kind of violence that we now get in South Africa. Not just criminal violence, but violence against children, violence against women, and violence particularly against old people as one. My focus, because I've read Johan Galtung and so, there's also forms of structural violence, where the structure, the economic structure in the country is still inhibiting and frustrating and, in a certain sense, even blocking an equitable redistribution of wealth. So this is now, the minister will not say this in public, but I can say that in public, we've got a new class structure. A new class structure with poor, mostly blacks at the bottom, and then another class at the top. So the race thing has also been integrated with a class problem. Yeah.
In regard to immigrants, he was asking, Willie.
He was asking.
In regard to the immigrants from Angola and Zimbabwe.
Oh yeah, we do have a serious problem with immigrants. They're coming from Ethiopia, from Somalia, many of them. And there is now a reason for the xenophobia. That is my reason. It's not here in this document. I wanted it to be written into the document, but I couldn't get it through. But I'd say that because of the poverty experienced by indigenous South Africans, the xenophobia has to do with that, with the socio-economic gap or the justice gap. It has to do with that, not because they're Somalians or Kenyans. It has to do with that. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question to you is somewhat simple but complex. Whose justice? If you say there's a justice gap, whose justice do you refer to? Justice becomes politicized, it becomes an issue, it becomes a debating point. So when you say there's a justice gap, whose justice are you referring to?
It's a very important question. I think for another reason, within the African context where I move now, with these students from elsewhere, they're talking about the justice of the West and asking questions. Now, what kind of justice is that? And the double standards. And in fact, it's fascinating how they use an American who was one of the lecturers on this Falk, F-A-L-K, a paper he wrote, presented. They use him to confront me. I have to answer those difficult questions. That's fascinating. I think in South Africa, and I want to focus it on South Africa, the justice as a very practical sort of meaning, justice. The legal system works, it's okay. Access to the legal system is the issue. Because if you've got money, then you've got access. So that is one element. The other element is that let me give you an example. We're now experiencing violence on the local level in townships against poor service delivery, against poor service violence. We'll see more of it. Why? Because those who have the right to get good services don't get it. Reason? Corruption. So the justice gap is not just something philosophical or whatever. It has to do with bread and butter stuff and with service delivery that they have a right to, but it's not been given. That is it. And let me add to it, and those who they blame, the councillors, are members of their own party.
So we'll take perhaps 2 more questions and then, okay, yes, sir.
Thank you, Professor, very much for your enlightening talk. As you know, if Yanni Botas, he keeps me posted on many things that I never even thought about in South Africa. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I wonder if we could go to a kind of a more global look at some of the things you mentioned. It's evident that it was crucial in getting the talking about talks started that there be secrecy at very high levels. Do you think that's possible these days in many, if not most, if not all, of the kinds of situations that face the global community?
On a lighter sort of, I'm so glad that I did what I did in the 80s. And not today. That is my answer. But I need to say something else. You know, when you're really serious dealing with violent conflict, as happening in the Sudan and in Somalia, and our delicate talks taking place. Same with the Turks and the Kurds, the Kurdish group. I met with them. Very interesting. The national intelligence, Turkish national intelligence was involved in talks with Öcalan. Was sabotaged by the military a couple of years ago. Turkish military. Now, what I do not understand in my conception of responsibility is that this kind of information that should be kept confidential because it has to do with people's lives and the possibility of peace, that for whatever purpose it is made public. And then the process is destroyed. What I'm saying is something that I got from Mitchell, in fact, before I've met him. The spoilers. I regard them as spoilers. And whether they say they're good journalists or what, I say you're a spoiler. Because there's something else, I think. You need to weigh it up. So I have a very strong view on that. I'm not popular.
So perhaps one more. I know that Dennis has had his hand up here, so maybe we could take this side and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Professor Esterhuyse, it's a pleasure to have you here, sir. I've heard that the Afrikaner business community played a very important role in bringing apartheid to an end. I was wondering if you could talk about that role, and also to what extent you think the Afrikaner or the South African business community and the global business community can still play a role in reducing the justice gap in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I took a group of Afrikaner businessmen on 2 occasions to meet with the ANC in exile. there's a reason. They asked for it. I didn't propose it. What was the reason of the ANC leaders? They said, listen, we want to talk to these people because they're closer to the seats of power and they have a much closer identification with the continent. It was a very interesting argument. The wasteland argument also played a role. And I think that was an important argument from the side of the ANC because they said they don't want to inherit the wasteland. What must they do with the wasteland? So, your second point is actually the point. This is why I so much enjoyed what I've seen here on the screen. Not the film, the Lynch. What would the world have been if there were not people with a philanthropic attitude? We do not have enough philanthropists in South Africa, white and black. White and black. And I think the business can play a decisive role in making the National Development Plan work. And I think if that alliance or partnership can be put together, because it's also in the interest of government that business cooperate, as it is in the interest of business. And if that partnership, this is what Mandela had in mind, and I think we're moving closer to that kind of partnership. The labor legislation and stuff like that plays a role. And the unions, there's a problem within the unions also, but I'm very positive that we will see closer cooperation between government on policy. Let me just say, there's one thing I learned when I spent some time here at the World Bank. I've tried so many things which didn't succeed. But nevertheless, is that you can't have good projects in a bad policy environment. And this is where business must come in. And we do have the policies.
So let's again thank our guests this evening. While we're not very old, we are 25 years old, and we don't have a 25-year tradition, but we have a 2-year tradition. We can actually blame Rich Rubenstein, I think, for this tradition, because what we're going to do is to give you when we changed our name from ICAR to SCAR, we've decided to promote the SCAR. Sorry, I have to get this ribbon off this thing. And so this is Rich's idea. Of escargot. All right, so this is... for you to remember us. And we also, we have about 20 books out in front that are available for purchase if people are interested, and I'm sure that we can talk him to stay around for a few minutes for individual questions if you'd like to. Thank you for coming this evening, and thank you for our celebration.
I like the snail.